Yeah, I want to make the argument that capitalism is tied to fossil fuels. And I want to make that argument kind of in absence of like a sort of moral view of society, right? I want to try to point out that actually the problems that we're facing with climate change come from the system itself, and the way that the system maybe shapes people, but also sort of coerces people into acting in certain ways, rather than, I don't know, capitalists just being evil or something. Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that fossil fuels are a feature, not a bug of capitalism. Secondly, I'd like to talk about how capitalists and capitalist governments cannot transition away from fossil fuels. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about how the environmental movement must pivot towards a wider anti-capitalist movement and must center workers. By the end of this talk, hopefully you all will have lost all hope in the possibility of switching to a low-carbon society without a revolutionary socialist change to get there. Not saying that's impossible, we'll just need a revolutionary socialist change to get there. So who am I? This is a photo of me, bright-eyed and innocent, 17 in 2019 during the climate strikes. So I was an organizer in the Waikato strikes. I was living in Cambridge, got like 20 people from high school to go, but the wider march was a couple thousand, and then thousands of others throughout the country. But I've been involved in ecology and conservation since I was about 7, doing things like volunteering for DOC and cool stuff like that. However, following the sort of breakup of the school strike for climate in New Zealand into sort of factional bickering and COVID, I became politically demobilized, as you can probably imagine. It was quite a demotivating experience, I guess. And it took me quite a long time to sort of fully learn the lessons from that movement. And I hope that I've sort of learnt what about it was good, what about it was bad, and hopefully I can convey that to you on this talk. More recently, I studied ecology at this uni. And in my master's, I modelled climate change and focused on its impacts on native orchids. But I came out of that thinking, like, what's the point in just studying climate change if I'm not actually able to sort of put that theory into action and try and prevent it, Like, while that research is valuable, I felt like it needed some follow-through on the ground. And at the moment I'm working as a botanist and an ecologist, and slowly but surely unionizing my workplace. I joined ISO about a year ago, and now I see the world through a kind of Marxist ecologist lens, which is a connection which works incredibly well and kind of enriches both of those things. I guess I'll get into capitalism. I'm going to pretend that none of you know anything about capitalism, so I'm going to introduce it on the sort of most basic level. Us Marxists view society as made up of classes. So predominantly, most people fit into kind of 2 boxes in our society. So that would be capitalists and workers. Now, the capitalists are people who own the means of production. So all of the stuff that's needed to make stuff. So your boss who owns a company and all the stuff that you use at work, or the investors who own stocks in your workplace. And these people have an outsized impact. So they influence what happens in the state, but they also control everything that happens in the workplace. And they're the main beneficiaries of the market. So they're able to shape a lot of things about our society. And workers are the people who are employed to work for capitalists. They do not own the means of production, or we do not own the means of production, and are forced to sell our labor power to a boss. The sort of cruel irony is that while capitalists own just about everything, they're only able to exist because there are workers that create everything that they sell. And so while workers are not inherently powerful, they have a huge degree of potential power if they organize, because they make everything that runs the system. So yeah, what drives capitalism? The sort of central part of capitalism is competition. That's what sort of pushes capitalism forward. And that's competition primarily for investors and for consumers. So investors want to invest in companies that are going to make the most profit. And consumers are essentially most of the time buying the cheapest commodities, or obviously there's exceptions to that. And both of these things, a corporation can achieve both of these things. They can achieve cheap commodities and also produce lots of profit by driving down workers' pay, or by increasing the cooperation of labor, increasing the division of labor, and replacing human labor with machinery. So it's that last part that I'm going to focus on quite a lot, the replacing human labor with machinery. So mechanization sort of increases the quantity of commodities that can be produced by one worker, and that drives down the cost. But for that mechanism to occur, what it needs is cheap energy, because it's only going to be worth replacing workers with energy if you can, if that costs less than employing more workers to make the same amount of stuff. And also the advantage gained through mechanization is temporary. So one corporation can increase its efficiency, but that will then force others to do the same. So this basically causes a constant race where each corporation wants to gain a small amount of advantage over each other corporation, leading to a constant drive to increase the amount of energy used in production. Fossil fuels also kind of increased the energy supply, and capitalists used that to gain competitive advantage over each other. I guess I already said that. Yeah, and that sort of explains this crudely hand-drawn scribble on a pie graph. So all of these amounts, all of these bits of emissions, about 46% of emissions can be attributed to this mechanization of labor. So it's things like energy use in industry, as well as shipping, trucking, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, all of these things sort of increase the amount of stuff that can be produced by a single worker. And these are all things that capitalism, through its drive of competition, basically draws out. And these are the emissions that are the result of that. Now, capitalists are also tied by that competition, so they can't sort of choose not to engage. They can't choose to reduce their energy emissions if it's not going to give them some kind of benefit in terms of production or profit. And that's because capitalists are inherently replaceable. So CEOs are just employees of investors. They can be thrown out by the investors if they're not making the right decisions. And equally, a company that makes itself uncompetitive can be easily replaced by another company that doesn't care. So this increased efficiency, or any increased efficiency, also drives down the price of energy, which causes an incentive to then increase production and use that energy that is therefore not being used. So if you can think of like Tesla, for example, if they get a new machine or something which uses less gas to smelt metals, then they might as well just smelt more metals for the same amount of gas. It costs the same to them. And it makes everything cheaper. And another example is Whanganui-a-Tara. So they make around $750 million a year after tax annually. And they had decided recently that they would switch away from coal to more sustainable fuels. But they would only do that when the government gave them the money to pay for it. So that was they have $750 million after tax that they could be spending on these replacements. One of these replacements cost about $60 million. That was replacing coal with solar. So they can afford it, but they're not going to afford it because those profits aren't owned by the company. They're owned by the investors who own the company. I mean, they also were going to switch from coal to wood pellets, which is actually less efficient than coal. So, not great. And that is why we see this pattern. So, while there is an increasing share of renewables creating energy, that's not actually reducing the amount of fossil fuels that are being used. So we're actually seeing an increase in fossil fuels and an increase in gas and an increase in coal, but renewables are being added on top of that. And the reason for that is because every time you add a new new source of energy, what you're actually doing is you're slightly reducing the price of energy. And so capitalists will take that as an advantage and will use more energy. So why doesn't the state intervene? Sort of the central question, right? From a Marxist point of view, we see a nation is split between capitalists and workers, and those capitalists have an overwhelming amount of power over the state. So they can use bond markets and investments to kind of cripple the state, so they can stop buying bonds and cut the state off from access to funds, essentially, to debt. Or they can stop investing in industry. So it's basically this noose that they hold around the state. And equally, they, as we're seeing at the moment, they use campaign finance to directly control politicians. So, New Zealand First recently got 40K of donations from a mining executive, and equally the National Party got that, and AXA got that. And that's just a drop in the bucket. There's heaps of executives doing the exact same thing. But yeah, despite this, from time to time, the sort of interests of most people, which is in avoiding climate chaos, push through because there's large campaigns that force the state to act. And so they do things like carbon taxes, exploration bans, carbon markets, all of these sorts of things to kind of look like they're doing something. And basically the approach with all of these is to sort of fix what they call market failures. What we would call inherent sort of contradictions in capitalism, they call sort of just like this accident that you can fix. And so the way that they're trying to fix it is by adjusting prices. So carbon tax makes it slightly more expensive, or in theory makes it slightly more expensive to emit. And so, yeah, that can actually have an impact. That these can lower emissions, but only domestically. The reason for this is that when you do this, you basically shift around where it's profitable to emit carbon. So the coal is still all being produced. It's just that instead of being burnt in Germany or New Zealand or Australia, it's being burnt in Malaysia or China or Indonesia. It just shifts around the emissions. And so the result of that is that actually, while these can reduce domestic emissions, they don't reduce global emissions. Yeah, we're also seeing at the moment that even good policy, for example, the creation of an agency whose sole purpose is to manage New Zealand's publicly owned land for conservation, that can be rolled back in times of economic crisis. This guy is a really good example of this as well. So this is Mark Carney. He's not, an ostensibly evil man like Winston Peters or Luxon. So he is the Premier of Canada at the moment, and he spent most of his career working in climate diplomacy. So out of any politician, he knows exactly what's at stake, and he knows what should be happening. And yet, in his last year in office, he's cut a whole bunch of climate programs and expanded fossil fuel projects, citing the need to balance the economic and environmental sort of realms. And this really demonstrates the sort of power that the economy has over everything, over politicians and capitalists. So while he may be kind of ostensibly green, he's been made to do this. Now, I think we can actually build an anti-capitalist green movement. I think that so far throughout the environmental movement, we've seen lots of wins and losses, and lots of significant wins. We saw the founding of DOC. That took decades of campaigning, and we saw climate taxes get put in. We saw, all sorts of things. But these can be lost as long as we stick with the capitalist system, because as long as the capitalists remain in power, they will fight back. The movement keeps being limited by the capitalist system itself. So there's only so much that it can achieve, as I said, while we're stuck in a capitalist economic system. To me, it's obvious that we need a revolutionary approach. Like if we just make a small change in New Zealand and it's offset by a change somewhere else, what we actually need to be doing is having a sudden break with capitalism, having a sudden reduction in emissions. I really don't think there's any other way to do it. And it can't be limited by national borders. It's got to be linked through solidarity throughout the world. I think the school strike had a lot of this inherent within it. Like it was this international movement that involved the masses. But I also think that it was atomistic in a sense. Like it limited the approach to demands to one nation or whatever, and it also was often co-opted by political parties. And the unfortunate thing about that is that this was the first time that millions of young people learned to use their political voices, learned to organize for themselves, and learned to sort of feel their political power. But many of the people who I organized with are now in, say, the Green Party or Labour. The political parties have said that what they need to do is organise for an election campaign, and then they'll do the rest of the work for them. It's disempowering, and I don't think that it actually puts power into the hands of the people who can change the system. Like we saw earlier, politicians aren't capable of changing the system. Yeah, they're tied. They're tied in so many ways. Yeah, I think that the environmental movement should always aim to mobilize people, to recruit people during moments of struggle, and to upskill them and increase their confidence in themselves and each other. And this is what we call cadre building in the socialist movement. So we do things like, when a new person comes along, give them a few tasks, we'll educate them, we'll sort of help them gain confidence in themselves, which can end up creating sort of lifelong organizers. We don't want to be activists, we want to be organizers, we want to be drawing people in and creating a sustained movement. I also don't think that the environmental movement can overthrow capitalism on its own. I think that, naturally campaigns end up being sort of siloed in their own little area. I think that, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there have to be connections between campaigns so that when there's a big movement, you can draw people into general anti-capitalist politics and actually have a chance of overthrowing the system, which is sort of creating all of these problems. A bunch of examples of recent events that I think we should sort of expand the definition of climate action into. So there's been the Freeze Free protest recently in the campuses. It's been all of the anti-trans rhetoric from New Zealand First and the reaction to it. Thousands of people coming out. It's been Toitu Te Tiriti. We had several hikoi involving thousands of people again. Gaza, there's been endless protests involving heaps and heaps of people. Who could have been, well, in many cases have been drawn into the movement. There's also, it's been pay equity, and I'm sure there's many others that I haven't mentioned here. I also think that really critical is the workers' movement. Now, workers alone have the power to end capitalism. I think we've sort of demonstrated this. Like very little in society is produced by anyone but workers. We make up about 72% of the working age New Zealand population, the rest being self-employed or bosses. And due to the globalization of capitalism, that's true pretty much everywhere in the world. Through strikes, workers won all of these main sort of labor rights. So, right to, minimum wage, the 8-hour day, holidays, many others. Even the right to vote was won by striking workers, like way back at the sort of beginnings of capitalism in England. There's also been a whole heap of general strikes that have precipitated in these really large revolutions. So, for example, the end of World War I, that was the German workers going on a general strike and forcing their government to surrender. The end of apartheid was precipitated after a whole series of general strikes and continuous sort of ramping up of the labor movement controlled by the black workers. And yeah, I mean, the sort of like white ruling class, I guess, was forced to make a deal. Otherwise, they would have lost everything. Because they made a deal, they still own most of the land in South Africa. It also ushered in the world's first workers' state in the USSR, which, I mean, you can ask me about that later, I guess, what happened to the USSR and why it wasn't a sort of shining green beacon on the hill. But yeah, as opposed to capitalists, workers are shaped to learn how to work with others, right? Each of us makes up only a small part of the end commodity, which is sold back to generally workers. And this is sort of reflected in the union movement. We rely on each other. And so in the union movement, you have these values like solidarity, uniting people across race, gender, religion, and national lines. And unions have always been on the forefront of fighting for representation, equality, and internationalism. But as you may have noticed, the sort of relevance of unions today is about the lowest it's ever been. So they've reduced from a high of about 70% in New Zealand in the 70s to around 10.6% of the working population today. The most important thing that I think any of us can do that could give workers enough power to end the capitalist system is to organize in our own workplaces, whether that means joining existing unions or, like me, trying to unionize your workplace for the first time. Yeah, I think for me, this is my most important piece of climate action, sort of ironically. Yeah, I guess what are the lessons from my talk? The main things I want you to take from this is that capitalists are driven by economics into unsustainable practices, right? Like some capitalists may be evil, Trump, Bezos, Musk. I think it's pretty easy to make a case for them being fairly evil. But it isn't their personalities that have produced climate change. And the implication of this is that moral appeals to capitalists are futile. And there's really no way to vote our way out of climate change either. The state is just an unreliable partner. And yeah, I think climate change really is just a capitalist crisis. I think that the environmental movement must understand capitalism, help rebuild the workers' movement, and build a broad coalition to fight for the end of climate change. That might seem like a fairly big ask, which is why we have the Socialist Party. The point of an organization like ISO is to cohere all sorts of different movements. It's to produce educational material and to debate current ideas. It's to build cadre, to upskill workers and students in organizing and writing. And, as individuals, we can unionize our workplaces, we can attend protests, and we can discuss politics with workmates. And all of those things are important, but the kind of impact you can have in a wider organization that can cohere a whole bunch of different aspects of politics is much, much larger. So in the Te Whanganui-a-Tara branch, we have members in about 6 different unions. We're involved in the Fees Free campaign. We have a whole bunch of members in Student Justice for Palestine. We are part of the campaign for the academic board to enact the BDS motion. We're in the Porneki Anti-Fascist Coalition. That's only our branch. There's also 2 other branches in other cities that are doing all sorts of other things. But you'll notice that there's a campaign sort of missing there, and that would be the environmental campaign. Now, this is an area that a lot of us would like to expand into, but I think that we need help to do that, which is why I wanted to make this talk. I'd like to convince all of you that you should join us. Bring your skills and your experience and your conviction, build a movement that can end capitalism in our lifetimes.